Sid Eudy passing away at the age of 63, a really memorable professional wrestling character that had so many interesting runs in his career. And in some ways, you could look at Sid as somebody that was like I mean, going through Today Way, just like the various photos of Sid, and I settled on this one. I don't know if there's a bad photo op that Sid was involved in. This man, like, if you want to, like, this man just, he was not charismatic in the traditional sense. His promos were, albeit super entertaining, I will never say were his calling card, but this man, there were just some weird ingredients that came out to produce this professional wrestler that was in his own lane. And either you felt that, you know, he had a limited skill set and overachieved in his career, or you could argue that he had a lot of struggles in his career that he ended up on the outs of certain companies and didn't quite reach as high of a level. You could argue either way. He's such a fascinating character. And as someone that, when I first got into professional wrestling in early 1992, I was so drawn to this guy. And I remember that first WrestleMania that I was watching as an active fan. And I had been watching this guy put people on stretchers, that super memorable angle of destroying the barbershop, and he's got the cream all over his face. I mean, that was a haunting image for me as an 8-year-old. And I remember thinking, man, this guy's going to murder Hulk Hogan, and I'm here for it. I really enjoyed this guy as a child. And I think that is going to be your opinion of Sid, is like kind of your age range of when you grew up as a wrestling fan and your attachment to Sid, because he will generate many different opinions. Obviously, they're going to be heavily skewed towards the memorable today in light of his passing. But you know, he was someone you can certainly say a lot of things about in terms of your fandom or lack thereof of a guy like Sid.
Yeah, certainly. He's an interesting person to talk about in hindsight, because I would say like a lot of my enjoyment, and I think I would say like our enjoyment as a community of his work, a lot of it wasn't necessarily, I think, by intent. You know, like a lot of what we've enjoyed about Sid, it is sort of like unintentional. But like, I don't know, in the end, like at this point, years removed from his run, and unfortunately at the end of the man's life, I just kind of look at the totality of what he offered us, and it was hours and hours and hours of great memories and entertainment and joy, you know. So I'm just like, I'm so glad he existed in professional wrestling for various reasons, and I'm very sad he's not around. There have been a lot of deaths actually lately in professional wrestling. But this is a guy that I actually grew up with. So like, it's, you know, it's kind of a piece of my childhood, and there are a lot of great Sid memories, let's just say, you know.
Oh yeah, there's plenty of them. And I'm not going to do like the extensive bio. I wrote a bit about him today, but I would like to write something more in depth about Sid later this week, because there's so much there. Like, this was pretty much today. This was all just like top of mind of just, and you go through him, and it's like, here is a guy that was just in all these different scenarios, and very few people that were positioned as like the top guy in WCW, the top guy in WWF. He had the Memphis history. This guy so he started off in Memphis as Lord Humongous, and that's kind of where he cut his teeth. And I think that's
What a name.
Lord Humongous. I mean, there you go. It's man was ready made for that. His first, like, this guy and Mark Calloway, they worked in Memphis together. They were together in WCW when Calloway replaced him in the Skyscrapers, and then they would headline WrestleMania together. So that was not part of their backstory going into that year's WrestleMania, that it's Lord Humongous and Mean Mark headlining WrestleMania in Chicago. But I find the Memphis territory to probably be a very instructional period where he is around all of these veterans. It's an old territory, but doing all these wacky angles. And I think that kind of wired his brain for pro wrestling. This was not somebody, like, we talk about a lot of, you know, current generation performers that grew up as fans, and that comes with like a great appreciation for the industry. I think a lot of respect for the fan base, but there's also like that other side of like, you're happy to be there. Sid was never that guy. He was willing to walk. And that's a great power to have. It can also be to your detriment. But this dude was not afraid to walk away, no matter what the spot was. And
depending if there was softball around.
Well, I mean, Softball Sid was a title that followed him to the point that, I mean, Ric Flair, quite the man when it comes to tributes in his like every capital letter to start a word today on Twitter. Part of his like tweet was the message to his family that Sid was more than just a softball player. I was like, I don't know if that would have made it into my cut if I was just tweeting about a man that had passed away that I had been a colleague of through many decades. But Flair did work that into his tribute here.
Much more than a softball player. Interesting.
Yeah. Period.
I mean, maybe to Flair, like that was Sid's, sort of title first and foremost.
He had the rep that, when he was like nursing injuries or he'd disappear in the spring, like that became like this guy loved his softball, and that followed him. And there were all these stories with him. There was the squeegee with Brian Pillman. Those are a little more comical. And then you have like the very, very serious incident with Arn Anderson that we'll get into. But after Memphis, his next big run is this is shortly after Bruiser Brody dies, and New Japan has like a foreigner spot open, and Sid goes over to New Japan in early 1989, and his first match, the first night of the tour, is challenging Tatsumi Fujinami for the IWGP title, which is a match that everyone should dig up this week. And then he worked Inoki on that same tour, like a singles match with Inoki in 89, putting over Inoki. And he only did the one stint with New Japan and did not end up with them. Instead, he goes to WCW for his first of many stints. And this is the Skyscrapers stint, which he goes down to injury and Calloway replaces him in the team. And then in 1990, he's put in the Horsemen, which is the Barry Windham, Ric Flair, Arn Anderson version. And this was kind of the first time the Horsemen put in like the big muscle guy. Then this was carbon copy what they were looking for when they put Batista into Evolution, was to have the muscle guy, and that's what Sid was. And he ended up working with Sting for the NWA championship that year and ended up becoming a big heel. And then he got the offer to go to the WWF in 1991. And he basically went to Jim Herd and said, hey, I'm getting promised a big spot in WWF. I want to leave. And they ended up working him out where his final night is against El Gigante, which is a 2-minute and 13-second match at the very first Super Brawl that Dan Lavransky was there live for. And if you ever want to see Sid, his final night in the territory, he was there to do his job and then get up and get the hell out of there. And off he went to New York. He comes in, and at the time, it's like, okay, here's this guy who garnered some good notoriety in WCW, and now he's going to New York, where this guy just screamed New York in 1991, and he comes in, he's the referee at SummerSlam, and it leads up to the program with Hogan, which they do very famous ending to a Royal Rumble match, maybe the most famous Rumble match, which is Sid eliminating Hogan, and then Sid is left with Ric Flair. And with his back turned to Flair, Hogan grabs Sid's arm and yanks him over as Flair dumps Sid, becoming champion. And this was in Albany, New York. And Sid always seemed to connect in the Northeast. And they had to, as I recall, have to edit this heavily because this crowd went nuts cheering for Sid when he eliminated Hogan. And this was the source of a lot of friction between these two. They worked through Mania. And then the story that had come out years later through Dave Meltzer's reporting was that Sid had failed a drug test before that year's Mania, but they were going to let him do Mania and the European tour after. And then he was supposed to be suspended. He ultimately quit, and that's his exit from WWF the first time. And he goes back to WCW. That produced the some tremendous vignettes with alongside Vader, with Sting and Davey Boy Smith, with the ship exploding and some of their mini films that they were producing at the time, like a total low light time of WCW. Sid was pushed as a top heel. Yes. I mean, moments like this, tremendous stuff of them in their Sid and Vader in their wrestling gear on the beach with Colonel Rob Parker. But again, he comes in, big spot. He's in a top heel position, and he was slated for the headlining match with Vader at that year's Starrcade, and they pulled him because they had to fire him after the incident with Arn Anderson overseas in England, which is a very famous story where they get into a big fight, and Sid ends up using scissors and stabbing Arn Anderson. And it was a big story then. I cannot imagine the level of attention that would get today. Like, I think to some degree that was where CM Punk was coming from after last year, that the history of this business, this is not the worst thing in the world, and people could sit down, talk, and work together, which these two would not in 1993, but would work years later when Sid would come back to WCW. But that's his ouster from WCW, and another top position. This one he is not walking away from, but he is being told to leave. And then he would USWA. He would have his time like going back to Memphis. But the next big run is in '95, where he's the bodyguard for Shawn Michaels and doing that angle right after WrestleMania where he turns on Shawn and powerbombs Shawn. And that's our first big Shawn Michaels singles run as a babyface, while Sid is married to Diesel and did multiple pay-per-view main events with Kevin Nash going into that summer. And 1995 is a very active year. It was his most active year as a performer. And going into 96, he's out for the first 5-6 months of the year. And then when Ultimate Warrior walked out, Sid was brought in to replace Warrior in the In Your House 6-man tag, and Sid gets a big reception, and that's the kickoff to his big run throughout the fall, where he is positioned as like a babyface at that time, but going into the match he gets with Shawn Michaels at Madison Square Garden. That is a very well remembered entrance for Sid, and that New York crowd at MSG, they all got behind Sid in that match, and they went nuts when he won the championship. And he felt like he was at his pinnacle that night in 1996, becoming champion, and would be programmed with Shawn and Brett over the next several months. He would flip the title back with Shawn, would get it back the following month, and then headlines with The Undertaker, a pretty disastrous main event with The Undertaker at WrestleMania 13, which is more remembered for the Bret Austin match underneath. And this was a poor number that WrestleMania drew as well. And then that run comes to an end shortly after this car accident he's in, and he's injured, and he's let go by the company later in 97. And then bounces around. He has a very short run in ECW, which was something else, because during this period, the ECW was so much positioning itself as like anti-WWF, anti-WCW. And then Sid walks in and they treated this guy like a god in ECW. He just did some short squash matches. He was around just for a few months, did a handful of matches in and out, and then gets back into WCW. And I always remember this segment where he's in the ring with Flair and Arn Anderson, and they go to break, and the camera is on the ring, and Arn and Sid are talking in the corner, and they shake hands. And this is not like an angle. This is not something they're drawing attention to. You just see them in the ring. And if you knew the story, how symbolic that was, and the fact that those two could bury the hatchet and work together was quite impressive at the time, given the history, the 6 years earlier. And this was his last big run. He had the program with Bill Goldberg, including a Halloween Havoc match that was well above what you would have assumed a Bill Goldberg and Sid match would look like in 1999, and then gets the WCW title in the wake of Chris Benoit's exit, and kind of gets pushed.
He was in the match he was in Benoit's last match in WCW.
Yeah, and they did the finish where he's got the foot under the rope, and when Benoit does not opt to stay with WCW, they get the title onto Sid. And during that very brief several month period with the new booking committee under Kevin Sullivan and others, Sid is pushed as the lead babyface, working with Nash and Hall. And then when Russo and Bischoff come in, he's got an injury, and he's pretty much gone for the entire duration of Russo and Bischoff's reign. and then comes back at the end of the year, worked Starrcade that year in the main event with Scott Steiner. And then you fast forward to January, and that's another like infamous moment involving Sid, where his leg snaps in one of the most gruesome injuries you will ever see on a wrestling broadcast, where his leg like literally snaps, and that's the end. And you think about that end way. I was thinking about this today among many topics involving Sid, is that he was 40 at the time of that injury. If he doesn't get hurt, and again, he's 40 years old, is he somebody the WWE takes any interest in when they buy the company several months later? Or do you feel he would have been in the kind of Jeff Jarrett discarded talent pile by that point?
Well, what was his relationship like with the WWF and Vince at that point?
I mean, it's very clear there are the legends that they took care of and promoted, and he was not in that category. Like, he never got the big returns. Like, they did the one thing like years and years later in 2012, right before the Raw 1000 deal, and he came in and he squashed Heath Slater, and that was about it. But the guy never got the invite for the Hall of Fame. They never did like the big DVDs, or like he was not one of their he was not on their list of like the legends that would always get the call to show up on those shows and to do the cameos. Like, outside of this one appearance in 2012, that's about it.
Do we know if that was WWE's choice, or has Sid ever turned appearances?
I know when we interviewed him around 2007, he very much had his eyes on a comeback for WWE. Like, so by that point, I mean, he would have been around 40, 46-ish, 40, 45, 46. And he was hoping to come back.
Yeah, not old, but by wrestling standards.
No, I mean, like, we look at it, like, at that time, 40 at the end of WCW, yeah, you're on the older side, and he definitely had his injuries, but he was still someone that, you throw this guy, he does have a history with that fan base, and it's interesting. Like, they went for a Scott Steiner. I could have seen at some point having an interest in Sid, but that leg injury was devastating for him. It's amazing he did any more matches, period. But they were all just independent shots that he did all the way up until 2017. He wrestled his last match. But yeah, you have I think that his squash matches, very fun watches, and some of the segments. I mean, hey, we're live, pal. I mean, that there was Sid, the I've got half the brain that you do. I mean, the man, it was entertaining. I wouldn't call him a great promo, but an entertaining one. Yes, absolutely. And I mean, that screaming up and down voice. I mean, I was always captivated by him as a speaker.
Well, I guess, okay, maybe not great promo by the traditional sense, maybe, and by the traditional definition, but I always enjoy whenever Sid pops up on one of our Rewind-Aways and he gets to speak. I think it's a very unique combination of a guy who is that size, looks like that. I think has like a sort of, okay, maybe we question like his charisma again in the traditional sense, but like, look at this man's face. The fact that he's had opportunity after opportunity after opportunity, sometimes with the same companies and, any other company that he's been a part of, I think suggests the fact that, I mean, it's not just size is a big part of it, but there's something special about him as well. There's a very unique charisma about him. And I would add to that, like, the uniqueness. To me, the promo style is part of that package. The loud, quiet, loud promo style, I think, is something that he managed to perfect. And again, to have somebody who looks like this, who has this sort of like interesting sort of like physical charisma, was able to play the Psycho Sid character so well, be able to cut a type of unique promo that was memorable. I think is a very underrated aspect.
Popularized the body glove branded elbow pad that he always had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great moments with him. Like, someone that was a totally memeable wrestler before that was a term.
Yes, absolutely.
So there you have it. He leaves behind a wife, 2 children, including his son Frank, who was on Big Brother a number of years ago, and got some fame. Another memory I have is that that same interview. This was one that Dan Lavransky conducted with him, and when he was expressing his desire to make a comeback to WWE, and Dan was not like blowing it off, but it was like, oh, okay, that's nice. That's a great goal to have. And Sid just, what? You don't think I can do it? And it was one of the great moments. And we would always bring that line up. What? You don't think I can do it? And, that was a perfect Sid moment. I mean, it encapsulated it. Amazing. But I think if you grew up of that age through any of his WCW runs and the WWF, like throughout the late 80s and early 90s, I think if you were a kid growing up during that time, you're going to have a soft spot for Sid because he was just he was a unique presence. And I think also very, it does show you that here was someone that promoters were so drawn to, like the big two, like there was always another chance for a Sid. Like just think about like the Arn Anderson incident and being brought back. I mean, if that happened today, I think that person is excommunicated from wrestling at that point, or they would have so much just like, would that be worth it? And WCW in 1999, it was, and it was like not even a year. It was just over a year after that. Like he's in a main role in WWF. It's like this guy was brought in and he was not slow rolled back to the top. He jumped to companies and he was in top positions pretty much throughout the 90s. So there you go. Sid was 63 years of age. His son, Gunnar, released the news today, and that he had quietly been battling cancer for some time, but very, very, I won't say like super private individual. Like he would do the odd interviews, but really kept to himself. Like there's a fake Twitter account out there assigned to Sid that is not Sid. So do not rely on that as some kind of communication he was making over the years. But yeah, someone that really did not get the WWE spotlight in all of these years. And I mean, when you look at the names in the WWE Hall of Fame, Sid was a slam dunk, easy pick they could have done any year. And I think you're going to see that in the coming days of like the fond memories that a lot of the fan base had for Sid, who was, during down times in business was a big name for them.
Yeah, and it began today with their tribute.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of coverage for Sid. Like I just saw everywhere they were covering this.